do is throw a few of the diagrams and the summarized arguments onto PowerPoint slides. Hopefully I get enough time tomorrow morning to do that. But at any rate, the title is a kind of abstract title. Is ethics only about ethics? But basically, what I'm going to try to say is that in the most standard form of ethical reasoning, the way most people, going all the way back to Aristotle, reason through an ethical issue, that type of reasoning brings in not only abstract ethical principles, but particular facts. It's the particular facts of a situation that determine, whether an ethical principle applies. So I first discuss this type of reasoning, which is a little, abstract. But then the bulk of the paper, most of the paper, has to do with looking at the place that facts play in the climate change debate. So a lot of it is about the practical issue of that area. And so I'm going to read it, and then maybe we'll have a little time left for some discussion. I'm going to put either this or, well, like I say, the PowerPoint came out in the last class. So even if yours has trouble uploading, theirs didn't, so I could copy it to you. So you'll have a PowerPoint of this available as well. Okay, well, is ethics only about ethics? While my paper is not primarily intended to target professionals in the field, it's meant to target folks like you all. I should mention at the outset that there is an area of ethics called metaethics, a very abstract area of ethics, which focuses on the field of ethics itself, just as metamathematics focuses on mathematics as a subject matter. And so metaethics focuses on ethics as its area of study, and it deals with foundational considerations like arriving at proper definitions for the most basic concepts used within the subject of ethics, and whether there might in fact be a single correct method for approaching and answering ethical questions. Now, as metaethics centers only on ethics, for this area of the subject, the answer to my question is, I'm afraid, a trivial, rather uninteresting yes. Okay, for metaethics, it does deal only with ethics. But that's not where we're going to spend most of the time today. If we, however, shift the ground from talking about whether there's a single correct method for answering ethical questions, and not everyone believes that there is, and move on instead to actually using such a method ourselves, then we are out of the area of the merely abstract and theoretical and onto the practical, down-to-earth turf of applied ethics, where you and I live when we make our moral decisions on a daily basis. So most of this paper is going to deal with practical issues of down-to-earth applied ethics. And it is in the area of applied ethics that we'll dwell, as I said, from the remainder of the paper. But first, though, a few brief meta-ethical discussion issues on method. And this brief meta-ethical discussion is in order because it relates to the central question of the paper. Talking about a method for answering and reasoning through an ethical issue. Without doubt, the most long-standing and entrenched method used for approaching ethical questions and reasoning through them to an answer concerning what we ought to do dates all the way back to ancient Greece and employs a form of reasoning the philosopher Aristotle called a practical syllogism. And we are going to Aristotle's virtue ethics next in this class. Considered by many contemporary ethicists to be as relevant today as it was then, it is a pattern of reasoning you've probably used many times yourself without knowing it. In its essentials, it looks like this. And this will be my slide. As a general moral rule, we ought to keep our promises. We ought not to harm someone else. Things like this. But as well, this form for an ethical argument brings in particular facts relating to the situation where you make your moral decision. Now, Aristotle called this a practical syllogism because its conclusion is not a proposition, a statement that you ought to accept as true, like the conclusion of an ordinary piece of reasoning, but it's instead your conclusion regarding what you ought to do, an action that you think is morally required in a particular situation. So this pattern of moral reasoning shows us clearly that applied ethics is not only about ethics. The conclusion about what we ought to do describes our ethical obligations, and the rule or rules we use as a premise in our argument clearly relates to a moral standard, like keep your promises, or we ought not to harm others. But tying together this abstract moral standard with our concluded moral obligation is a specific concrete situation. In a specific concrete situation are particular relevant facts relating to the situation in question. Facts not themselves specifically part of ethics proper. Now, and I used to use Frankina's text, one of the best little texts on ethics available at the time. Contemporary ethicist William Frankina, and I'm sure he's no longer among us, illustrated Aristotle's practical syllogism with the reasoning process Socrates used to decide whether he should accept his friend's offer to facilitate his escape from prison into exile, thus enabling him to avoid the death sentence which had been meted out to him by the Athenian courts. Effectively using several practical syllogisms, Aristotle mulls over issues like whether he has a moral obligation to keep his agreements, whether we should obey our parents, and whether we should return harm for harm in retaliation. If wronged unjustly, it is important to him that he now do the right thing, not just the prudent thing, because he sincerely believes that harming his soul ethically will have negative repercussions for him, not only in this life, but in the next. It would literally be a fate worse than the imminent death he now faces. To illustrate the practical syllogism in action, one of his arguments might be summarized as follows. General moral rule. We ought to keep our agreements. One particular fact. As a citizen, I have an understood agreement with Athens to obey its laws and respect its court's verdicts. Just as it's understood that you have an understood agreement with Baltimore County to obey its laws, like its traffic laws. Okay. Second particular fact, by escaping into exile, I, Socrates, would in effect be overturning the court verdict which sentenced me to death. conclusion, I ought morally not to escape. And using similar reasoning, he concludes, Socrates, by bringing in additional factual considerations such as that the city has indeed been like a parent to him and would in fact be harmed by his escape, as laws so essential to a city's very existence would be broken by this course of action. He concludes that he should stay and face his sentence, that he is morally obligated not to escape. Now, whether we agree with Socrates' reasoning here, or his ultimate moral choice is here not the point. The point is that the most time-honored method for addressing an ethical issue and for reasoning oneself through it to a course of action on a moral question brings into play not only abstract ethical considerations, but concrete particular facts about the world. Part of the process of answering an ethical question by the use of a practical syllogism, therefore, is not just one of figuring out what abstract moral principles might relate to a given situation, but is also one of getting one's facts straight. It is the facts relating to a specific situation that determine whether a given moral rule even applies to it. Yet it would seem that the process of getting our facts straight should be the easiest part of resolving a moral quandary. After all, it is facts that are observable and intersubjectively verifiable, that is, publicly verifiable among people, using empirical methods, using observational methods. Abstract considerations of taste and values are not. This is an example. Mary and her college roommate can easily agree on the color of the dress Mary just bought for their big double date this weekend, but they may strongly disagree on whether or not the dress is beautiful. A question of taste. Historically, some philosophers have argued that matters of moral value are like moral matters of taste, not settleable observationally. Now, while many, if not most, contemporary ethicists have long ago abandoned the stark moral relativism and contempt for moral reasoning that this observation implies, can I really reason with you as to whether or not you should prefer chocolate ice cream to butter pecan? While they've abandoned this and maintain a confidence that it is indeed possible to seek reasoned solution to moral problems. That is, most ethicists do think we can reason out and reason through moral issues to a conclusion. That this issue, though, was ever raised at all clearly indicates that on the face of it, facts seem a lot easier to confirm than values. Now, the remainder of my paper will be taken up with challenging this initially plausible assumption by focusing at some length on the elusiveness of facts in the current moral debate over climate change. At this point, somebody is undoubtedly saying to herself or himself, debate over climate change? I thought that the debate over climate change is now over. A consensus on the issue now existing among reputable scientists in the field. Al Gore notwithstanding, I can assure you that this is decidedly not the case, and that, as Mark Twain might have put it, the death of the climate change debate has been greatly exaggerated. If you don't know the reference, there was a false report that Mark Twain was dead in some of the newspapers, and he surfaced and said the rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. That's what the reference is to. Well, first of all, I want to underscore the importance and centrality of this form of argument we've been looking at, of the practical syllogism, to the climate change debate through brief reference to a recent study published in the Journal for Activism in Science and Technology Education. And I give a reference there. I buried my references in the text because I may submit this to an online site, and that's usually the way they want it done. At any rate, to a study in which the authors examined approximately 50 science lessons with a view toward developing recommendations for incorporating ways to integrate more moral reasoning into the climate change curriculum, mostly in K through 12, mostly middle school and high school science lessons. Citing an anthology, Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, and I give the reference, and agreeing with its editor's claim that, quote, that society has not acted to avert the harms of climate change because the affirmation of moral responsibilities has been missing from public discourse, they, that is the authors of this study, follow these editors' adoption of practical syllogism as the paradigm for the moral reasoning that will enable us to deduce those moral responsibilities. In their study, they reproduce the anthology editor's example, and here's an example of something they give in their book. The factual premise. If we do not act soon, anthropogenic meaning what? Basically, human initiated, human caused climate changes. After all, that's what you're worried about in the climate change debate, because that presumably is what you can affect through things like legislation and public policy. If we do not act soon, anthropogenic environmental changes will bring serious harms to the future. Now, the moral premise, we have a moral obligation to avert harms to the future, so as to leave a world as rich in life and possibility as the world we inherited. And finally, the conclusion, therefore, we have a moral obligation to act and act now, that is, to avert the disastrous results of climate change. Now, a few pages later, authors of the study reinforce their adoption and recommendation of the practical syllogism as the best model for ethical argumentation on climate change by offering one of their own. Here's the factual premise. Carbon dioxide emissions worsen the effects of climate change on future generations, and there are other ways you can look at this. I won't read them. The moral premise, we have a moral obligation not to do things that will harm future generations. And the conclusion, therefore, we have a moral obligation to reduce our carbon emissions. Now, readers, and I hope you'll see, should easily see that except for the order of the premises, and the order you list premises in does not matter in most moral arguments. It does matter a little bit in traditional syllogisms, but that's a technical point we're not going to raise here. So ordinarily, it doesn't matter what way you list them. So you should see that basically what we've just looked at is the same form as Aristotle's practical syllogism, the form I presented earlier. Okay, on to the climate change part of it. A good central starting point for our discussion of the debate, and one from which we can branch out in other directions, is a little piece penned a few years ago by renowned meteorologist Joe Bastardi, and I give the reference. While making it clear that he is speaking for himself and not his long-time employer AccuWeather, he laments the fact that defenders of anthropogenic, man-caused global warming have tried to stifle debate on the issue and have reached wrong conclusions by failing to get their facts straight in two principal ways. Okay, in two principal ways. One, they have ignored well-documented and observationally confirmed facts from the past, especially those concerning ocean regime changes and their clear effect on the weather. And two, they have too often treated the projections of computer models as fact. And a lot of what I'm going to discuss has to do with the inadequacy of doing so, with the inadequacy of these computer models to accurately predict the climate, and therefore with the fact that if you're going to use the projections of these models as factual premises in moral arguments, you're going to fall short. So that's kind of where we're going. On to the next page. If we take into account the cold hard facts, says Bastardi, obtained from observations, he contends that we have more reason to conclude that the world is in for a 15 to 20 year period of global cooling, not global warming, as signaled by the similarity of the 2007 La Nina to one which occurred in 1950 to 51, and reversed a 30-year warming trend to a cooling period which extended throughout most of the 1960s. And I do remember much colder winters growing up with much more snow. And in fact, when I was growing up, 6 to 10 inches of snow on the ground looked like a lot more snow than we have out there. That's a good illustration of, the difficulty of what we're dealing with here. How wrong they got it. What Bastardi says is there are climate cycles. And the facts tell us that, quote, while it is occurring now, that what is occurring now has occurred before. This first colder than normal year worldwide, in his writing a few years ago, is one of the signs that we are getting ready to go back to a colder cycle on the order of 15 to 20 years. They show us that, quote, in the end, it is nature, not man, that will have its way with the weather. Other research bears Bastardi out on this. A 2007 article entitled A New Dynamical Mechanism for Major Climate Shifts contends that ocean oscillations could alone account for most of the Earth's warming and cooling over the past 50 years. And a point I make later is that defenders of climate change science say it's man-caused effects that do this. But rather than take into account the observational evidence, Bastardi claims that defenders of anthropogenic global warming would rather discard or ignore facts of the past relating to recurring climate patterns and instead place their faith in future projections made by computer models. Evidencing some of the shortcomings of these models to account for ocean regime changes, he cites their predictive failures relating to then recent La Nina El Nino patterns On these changes, the models are, to put it in his own words, utterly clueless or clueless. A far more extensive and technical analysis of the shortcomings of computer models for making climate predictions, especially for those relied on exclusively by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has been offered by Christopher Monkton in the newsletter of the Forum on Physics and Society. While the technical details of this landmark 2007 challenge to the veracity of the IPCC model projections lie well beyond the scope of this paper. After all, this is a philosophy paper in ethics, not a technical scientific paper. I think we can understand the main point he makes, which is simply that the IPCC's methodology relies unduly, indeed almost exclusively, upon numerical analysis, even where the outputs of the models upon which it so heavily relies are manifestly and significantly at variance with theory or observation or both. Model projections, such as those upon which the IPCC's entire case rests, have long been proven impossible when applied to mathematically chaotic objects, such as the climate, whose initial state can never be determined to a sufficient precision. In other words, why can't I, if all of your movements this afternoon were utterly predictable because you don't make free choices, and that's not my view, but some people think so, why can't I predict what you're going to do? It's because I don't have enough knowledge of the initial state of things to be able to accurately predict something in the future. And this is essentially the point he's making, that we're dealing with a system that is so much more complex, than, well, let's put it this way, that is so complex that adequate knowledge of its initial state can't be had by us. And so, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have adequate knowledge of the initial state, your predictions are going to be off. And, this is the central point. The central question in the scientific debate, let me go back. Specifically, where does Monkton think that the IPCC projections have gone wrong due to their overly optimistic reliance on computer models inadequate to the task of making long-range climate projections for such a complex and mathematically chaotic object? The central question in the scientific debate over whether and to what extent, if any, human beings have warmed the climate since the start of the Industrial Revolution, notes Monkton, revolves around the notion of climate sensitivity, which is, quote, the magnitude of the change in T sub s, which is the globally averaged land and sea surface absolute temperature. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but it's basically the average temperature throughout the whole world. After doubling CO2 concentration from the pre-industrial 278 parts per million to 550 parts per million. In other words, the way you make these projections is to say, well, let's double the CO2 levels as a control for how much you think, how much extra CO2 human activity has put in the air since 1750. And then let's make computer projections regarding global warming from the doubling of those CO2 levels. So the critical thing is T sub s, this average global temperature. It is precisely in predicting this temperature change accurately that IPCC computer models have fallen far short of actual observed values. The then most current comprehensive statement from the IPCC on this was contained in its fourth assessment report, and I give you a reference, which estimated the likely rise in T sub S in response to sustained industrial CO2 levels of 550 parts per million. It estimated it at 2 to 4.5 degrees centigrade. In other words, this is the rise, the model said, that increased human activity is going to produce in the overall average global temperature. The IPCC contention is that human activity, especially that productive of CO2 emissions, has been responsible for more than half of this projected temperature rise and will continue to contribute to a similar level of temperature rise in the future, with serious negative effects unless significant steps are taken through policies and agreements to mitigate the situation by curtailing worldwide CO2 emissions. But the factual premise supporting the moral argument for immediate and perhaps drastic action worldwide to attempt to head off the supposed dire consequences of climate change rests on the veracity of the models, of these computer models. As partial evidence supporting the deep flaws in their projection, Monkton at the time cited the following diagram representing an early 1988 attempt to predict the effects of CO2 emissions on the rise of T sub S through the year 2020. And this was a projection made by a guy named James Hansen from NASA, who got one of the first computer models together trying to predict the effects of CO2 emissions on climate change. While not itself generated by the IPC, well, this study was not. It was generated by Hansen's NASA. It pretty much concurred with that report's findings. So, in other words, this is Hansen's. These are Hansen's predictions of temperature rise through 2020. D is the IPCC's model prediction. But of course, and A here, the green line, is the temperature reduction Hansen argued would follow if we significantly reduce CO2 emissions. So you say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is this line G through H. See, here's Hansen's projection of the good we would do by, restricting carbon emissions. The problem is G through H is the actual measured and projected temperature throughout the period, which is much closer to the lower level than Hansen argued for. And that temperature has been occurring in spite of increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is what I say in the next paragraph. Hansen, the study's authors, presented this chart before Congress in 1988, using it to underscore his case for urgent action to prevent the projected temperature rise represented in lines B through C above, and the IPCC, based on its own model projection, was right there as well as seen from D. Now I'm going to try to project this on the screen using PowerPoint slide to mark. Hansen's contention then was that decisive global action on curbing CO2 concentrations could stabilize the situation at a much lower level, A, avoiding the projected temperature rise with its attendant negative consequences. But the bottom line factual point illustrated by the above graph is that the actual global temperature rise based on observational evidence through 2007, E above, was by contrast much lower and indeed closer to the stabilized figure Hansen hoped to achieve only if significant reductions in CO2 emissions were attained, all taking place during a period of rapid rise in CO2 emissions. In other words, the much feared projected warming just was not happening. But this is a 1988 model. But what I go on to say is, we need not be content, however, with looking at quarter-century-old charts to see the flaws in the IPCC's model projections. With the benefit of hindsight, we can make the same case in the from the most recent data available out of its own publications. Actual observations since 2007, as we shall see, have continued to undermine the veracity of its model projections of significant warming. First of all, though, a 2012 look back at the Hansen NASA model failed, prediction continues to show its predicted failures as warming has continued only modestly, much on the line observed by Monkton in 2007. So, in other words, with the benefit of hindsight, we can actually look back in 2012 and see the temperature has, the actual temperature has stayed low, well below that predicted by the computer model. So actual data, in contrast to what Hansen predicted with the NASA model, not only has not shown the significant warming he projected, but has actually shown a slight cooling trend, a fall in T sub S in recent years. Compare this model's predicted failure with that of a similar one used by the IPCC, whose parallel projections of significant warming have also not materialized as discerned from actual observational data. So that was Hansen's model. Here are several of the IPCC's models, basically from its first report, its second, its third report. And here again, note the lower, note how much lower are the actual observed temperatures from those projected by the IPCC's model. Another chart of satellite global temperature measurements confirms that there has been a cooling trend worldwide since 1997. That is, we have since then 184 months of cooling over the course of the planet, not warming as predicted by NASA and IPCC models. And I give a reference to that, but essentially, without dwelling on it, that's what this chart shows. So there's abundant evidence to indicate the failure of these models. And the point is, this cooling has happened in the face of steadily rising atmospheric CO2 levels. Go back for a second. The black line in other words, okay, here's basically stabilized temperatures. This black line represents the rise in CO2, and from June of 1980 through July of 2012, and yet, with the huge rise in CO2 emissions, there's been a relatively level and even a little bit of a falling trend in temperatures throughout the period. And this has happened in the face of steadily rising, as I said, atmospheric CO2 levels. Interestingly, now Hansen has come out recently with an argument, a moral argument of his own. Interestingly, after, which I'm going to get to in a minute, but interestingly, after presenting this graph, the author, as we have done, takes pains to point out explicitly that, quote, the slight cooling trend is opposite of what the IPCC and NASA's James Hansen predicted for global temperatures. As well, he presents in some detail the main factual premise in the moral argument over climate change as an hypothesis which needs support from model projections which clearly have now failed. In other words, because these model projections are used, their output is used as factual premises in the argument. And he sort of summarizes, the environmentalist case here. The IPCC prediction of rapid global warming is based on the hypothesis that human CO2 emissions would increase atmospheric CO2 greenhouse gas levels. The increase of greenhouse gases would allow more radiated heat to be retained, and the retained heat would warm the atmosphere, and the atmosphere would then warm the world's oceans and land surfaces, thus raising TS, right, which we've been talking about. Such predicted warming would set in motion a runaway tipping point that would produce catastrophic climate disasters and a doomsday for civilization. Now, compare this summarized premise with the premises we looked at earlier by defenders of anthropogenic global warming. We looked earlier at the premises that's from the anthology authors that say if we do not act soon, anthropogenic environmental changes will bring serious harms to the future, basically of the planet. And the one that the study of these curricula focused on carbon dioxide emissions worsen the effects of climate change on future generations. That is, the main factual premise in the moral argument for dramatic and urgent action on climate change becomes an hypothesis whose main support coming from computer model projections has been undermined by observational evidence. Now, Hansen has been in the news relatively recently, within the past year or so. Curiously, NASA's Hansen has made recent news with a moral argument whose factual premise is essentially the second one listed above, arguing, quote, that current generations have an overriding moral duty to their children and grandchildren to take immediate action, end of quote, to curb the supposed dire consequences of human-induced climate change. He calls this, quote, an issue of intergenerational justice on a par with ending slavery. But we have just seen that as empirical evidence shows that the global temperature rise as predicted by his own model will not follow, then neither will the destructive consequences he thinks we will bring on future generations through our greenhouse gas emissions. Hence, the crusade he wants to start for the adoption of a carbon tax worldwide to effect a 6% reduction in CO2 emissions seems as a consequence to lack his claimed moral foundation. If there is no such emergency, then there is no legitimate moral argument supporting such dire emergency measures, the factual premise of any such argument being false. Now, some of the more diplomatic defenders of the modeled projections and the clear variance of their predictions with observational data have described the unexpected stasis, that is, the lack of temperature increase, the temperatures remain relatively stable, stasis in warming over the past 15 years or so as simply a period in which global warming is, quote, at a standstill, obviously leaving open the door that it may resume again at any time. This, of course, raises the specter of whether this attempt to save their hypothesis from falsification by observational data is not in fact akin to that of Ptolemaic astronomers' attempts to save their own view of the heavens from falsification by observational evidence through the use of the artificial device of epicycles to explain the retrograde motion of some planets. That is a hedge which at the end will fail to do its job. Basically, Ptolemaic astronomy, which followed Aristotle, had the planets stuck out there on crystalline spheres. Now, if you track, day by day, the path of a planet through the zodiac, through the constellations of the zodiac, if the planet is really stuck on a crystalline sphere, it should just track across the sky like that. But the problem was, when they actually did this, some planets would perform what they called retrograde motion. They would track back on themselves and then continue on. Now that's something that should not be happening if they're really out there stuck on crystalline spheres, as Ptolemaic astronomy said they were. So did they take this as disconfirming evidence and throw away Ptolemaic astronomy? No. Instead, they introduced the artificial device of epicycles to try to save the theory. In other words, they try to patch it up. So, you have a planet. Let's say this is the main sphere that the planet is supposedly stuck on. What they said is the planet is actually stuck on what they called an episphere, a sphere that was on the planet, and it's because the planet is on an episphere, a small sphere, that you see retrograde motion. Well, this saves the theory, but in the end, ultimately, the Copernican system prevailed. And this discussion you find in the works of Thomas Kuhn, especially in his book called The Copernican Theory. Okay, well that is it. I know it's a lot to sit through, and it's a little bit technical. But any question, comment, whatever. You can tell this is not the company line on this, right? I mean, this is but I want to be kind of a gadfly on this and expose people to some of the opposite argument, because people are used to hearing people like Al Gore say, who by the way stands to make, and his company stands to make hundreds of millions of dollars selling carbon credits. So he's a little has a bit of a vested interest in not seeing this underway. I mean, just want to do the opposite case. So what I'm saying is, if you want in the next week or two, or today, if you've written some stuff, I'll take them now, or if you want to work on it in a week or two. That's fine. Yeah. Pardon? Yeah. Okay. What I said is, normally for these talks, I only give 10 points if you both attend the talk and write a little summary. Now, if you write this summary, you get 10 points extra credit. But I still would like to see some people who were thinking of maybe attending the talk tomorrow. Because I still would like to see some folks there. And so I will give you 10 points on top of that, so you can get your whole 20 points in one fell swoop if you want to, by actually attending the talk. It's an hour to an hour and a half. Basically, I just read through this in, 45 minutes to an hour. There's going to be a question period. It depends on who and how many people ask questions. If you have a class after that, you can kind of slip out. I'm going to have a roll somewhere, probably at the back, maybe at the front. Integrity. This thing, integrity does its job. If you want to review any part of it, but remember, you don't have to listen to an entire 45-minute integrity thing. You can look at the slides or at the pages presented here and just go to part of it and say, well, what did he say towards the end there? If you just want to listen to the last 10 minutes, okay, so again, if anyone has not taken the test yet, you need to make arrangements to take it in a testing center. Otherwise, I'll take them now or in the next week or two. There's not a huge rush, but thank you. And we'll plan to go over the test on Tuesday, first thing, and then get into a little Aristotle and what time remains. So.